Ohio Republican Senate candidate J.D. Vance, who's running on a populist agenda, has structured his income to exploit a controversial tax loophole that almost exclusively benefits the super rich, according to financial disclosures reviewed by The Lever. Founder of The Lever and editor-at-large of Jacobin, David Sirota, joins us now to discuss. David, welcome back to Rising Fridays.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so break down, this Lever report is super interesting. If you could just break down for us what you guys were able to see in the financial disclosures you reviewed, that would be awesome.
So the carried interest tax loophole was debated in the Senate recently. This is the loophole that almost exclusively benefits private equity managers, billionaires, and the like. It allows them to classify their income as capital gains and pay the much lower capital gains rate rather than the regular income tax rate. J.D. Vance, the Ohio Republican Senate candidate, has billed himself as a working class populist, a different kind of Republican. But financial disclosures show that he has structured his personal finances to potentially take advantage of this carried interest tax loophole that, again, is not available to most regular working people in America. On his disclosure, there are at least two funds where he says that he has a carried interest ownership stake in investment vehicles, in essentially private equity vehicles that would allow him in one case it says it entitles him to carried interest income. So basically what we see is that he, in his financial dealings, has gone ahead and structured his own personal finances to potentially take advantage of that loophole. And here's the important part. When he gets to the Senate, if he wins, he would be in a position, because of that chamber's arcane rules, to be in a position to potentially preserve that loophole, which politicians in both parties have said is a problem, that loophole. They have, Donald Trump criticized it. The Democrats tried to limit it. So this is a real live issue if Vance actually wins.
And David, in your story, you cite J.D. Vance saying in 2017 that one of the things that made Trump so successful with Republicans that he was willing to, to slaughter the sacred cows of the party, and he particularly referenced this type of loophole that only benefits kind of hedge fund, private equity, and VC goons. And you also point out that in that same year, the same year that he said that, he launched two more kind of private equity firms to then take advantage of it. It's almost as if he was seeing seeing it as kind of a how-to manual, like whatever Trump was going after. It's like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that, because he has a record, he has a history on Wall Street with private equity. That was in the past. This is post-Trump that he's getting involved with that. So what does it say that at the same time that he's kind of shifting away from his anti-Trump personality to a pro-Trump personality, that he's also then kind of taking lessons from Trump on how to exploit the best, the tax code the best?
Look, I think one argument I guess he might make, although he didn't comment for this story, he might make is, look, you deal with the tax code that you have, and as a private person, and that's what he did. Another argument would be, well, why has he been silent on this very big, high-profile issue? I mean, this was just debated on the Senate floor. The Wall Street tax loophole at issue here has been part of the political discourse for a long time. And J.D. Vance is out there portraying himself as a populist and has really nothing to say about this, has been kind of noticeably silent. And I should mention he's running against an opponent, Democrat Tim Ryan, who has co-sponsored the legislation to shut down this loophole. And one other important fact here, the super PAC, called the Senate Leadership Fund, which is reportedly about to spend $28 million to boost Vance's campaign. It's the Republican super PAC, and they've already spent millions to boost Vance's campaign. That super PAC happens to be bankrolled. Some of its biggest donors are the very private equity billionaires who are taking advantage or are big proponents of this tax loophole. That includes the CEO of Blackstone, which has been lobbying on the carried interest loophole as of the latest disclosures.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I actually like J.D. Vance, and I think he would say exactly what you said. You assumed in the first point, David, that he would say that I'm working with the tax code that exists, but you've done a lot of reporting on private equity, and it is one of the biggest sources of the class divide in the country that Vance talks about all of the time. And he has a history, as Ryan mentioned, both pre-Trump and post-Trump, and as the story, I think, makes clear in a helpful way, with private equity. And David, could you tell us exactly, like, if you're Tim Ryan, and if you're advising Tim Ryan, how would you talk about J.D. Vance's association and personal wealth built off of private equity for years?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, private equity has been linked to all sorts of kind of social ills, job layoffs, wage cuts, all sorts of things that are bad for non-private equity moguls. And J.D. Vance deciding to kind of make his personal fortune in that particular industry, I think that raises questions about what he thinks is important and what he and what he wants to do with his life, right? I mean, the private equity business model, it's important to stress, that's not the traditional business model of going to a company and building a company. Private equity is much of its business is about asset stripping. And trying to glean the most profits off of essentially the economic value of others. I think the other part of this is to actually explicitly be using the carried interest tax loophole and then being silent about it on the campaign when you're billing yourself as a populist. I mean, if Tim Ryan is the guy co-sponsoring the legislation to shut this down. I mean, he is essentially co-sponsoring the legislation to shut down a tax loophole that his own opponent is positioning himself to potentially use. That's a very one-to-one direct relationship between how policy works and who it affects.
Yeah, and I think the point about him being silent on this is the key one, because I think when it comes to Trump, for instance, Trump has said, on the debate stage, look, I pay low taxes because I'm smart, and you're an idiot if you pay more than you legally have to owe. And I think people pretty much across the board are like, okay, fine, yeah, you're as long as you're like within the law, then okay, good for you.
He argued that's why he could fix the problems. And you could see Vance like trotting out a similar argument with PE, like, hey, I know this world. But the silence, to your point, Ryan, is where that's key.
Right, and I think that's the tell. Yeah, that is, to me, that is the tell. That you go out there, you bill yourself as a different kind of Republican. At various points, Vance has said that corporations that export jobs, for instance, maybe need to face higher taxes or kind of tax penalties. But somehow he doesn't have anything to say on a very, very controversial tax loophole that he has positioned his own finances to potentially benefit from. That, to me, is the tell.
Right. Woke corporations, he said we're going to go after them. As you mentioned, I think in your piece, that when a bunch of companies got together and said, how are we going to respond to voter suppression laws? He's like, well, let's tax you. But when it comes to kind of, shutting down American companies, stripping their pension funds, and then shipping all of that work elsewhere, then getting a loophole, 20% tax rate as a result out of it, then he doesn't say as much. And I think it comes from, and Emily, I'm curious for your take, because you know him really well. Trump he's a super rich guy, and that's his identity, like that. So he doesn't. There's no cloudiness around that. J.D. Vance kind of has two identities. He's got the hillbilly elegy. He's got he grew up in poverty, and so he therefore understands what people have gone through. At the same time, then he went to Wall Street, and he's now fantastically rich. And so, which one of those identities is the one that he's presenting to the public? I think hampers him in his ability to talk about this. And clearly he agrees that the loophole is a good thing. And so otherwise the politics of it is obvious. Like if he was against this, he'd be talking about it.
Well, he's one of the Thiel-backed candidates, and he's close with Peter Thiel, obviously, and has been, and they're fairly good on like antitrust and big tech, right? Like a lot of the policies they suggest would genuinely not be great for some of those tech companies that Thiel, for instance, has had ties to in the past, and that Silicon Valley is broadly supportive of. So it's interesting to see, from my perspective, the disconnect there, right? Like they're willing to, be sort of populist, genuinely populist. They haven't taken votes on it yet, but the rhetoric on it suggests that they would vote in one way when it comes to tech. But that's where, again, I think to David's point, the silence on carried interest is a huge question. And that's tough for J.D. Vance because you can do the Dr. Oz thing, right, where he's super rich, everyone knows him for being super rich, and instead of doing what Trump does, wearing a $3,000 suit to the Iowa State Fair and giving kids helicopter rides, Oz rolls up his sleeves and pretends he's like actually doing his own grocery shopping and inflation is really hurting him. You could do that, or you can just say, but with Vance, he's no longer in the working class. He is really rich and successful, so it is kind of difficult. But I do think, to David's point, that's where the silence on this particular question is very interesting.
And can I just make one other point? I mean, I think it's worth underscoring. I also think what complicates this for somebody like J.D. Vance is the knowledge that private equity executives and private equity billionaires are some of the biggest funders to the super PAC, the Senate Leadership Fund, that is floating his campaign. I mean, literally just this week, the Cleveland Plain Dealer reported that the Senate Leadership Fund is set to spend up to $28 million to boost Vance in an Ohio Senate race that has been unexpectedly close in the polls. Some of the biggest funders of the Senate Leadership Fund include Steve Schwartzman. Steve Schwartzman, the CEO of Blackstone, Paul Singer of Elliott Management. I mean, these are folks, the biggest moguls out of the private equity industry that benefit from and vigorously defend the carried interest loophole. Point being that J.D. Vance not only has a personal financial sort of disclosure problem in terms of how he's structured his own finances when it comes to this issue, but he also knows who funds the big pot of money that he needs and wants for the stretch run of the campaign.
And why does Kirsten Sinema use her insane amount of leverage to protect carried interest? Because it's very important to the money. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. I bet personally he'd pay a higher tax rate if it means he gets to be a United States senator, which is what he wants to be. But if he calls for that higher tax rate, that $28 million bailout from the private equity-backed Senate Leadership Fund might not be coming his way. So I think that actually is probably more important than his personal finances. That's really well said.
Right. Well, David Sirota, thank you as always for joining Rising Fridays.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You can check out that story in The Lever, and we will be back with more Rising after this.